We've been talking a lot about social media interaction with local newspapers. In 2009, the New York Times was the first major newspaper to hire a social media editor. Since that time, they've had somebody full-time on staff, and we've seen that popping up in other newspapers around the country. Since the New York Times did that, we've seen a lot of academic research into the subject of social media interaction with local newspapers. Most of it, nope. There we are. Most of it has to do with Facebook and Twitter just because they've been around longer. You're seeing emerging research that has to do with Snapchat, Pinterest, and other sorts of areas, but there's just not much of it yet. The Pew Research Center is one of the biggest that's doing research, academic research on social media and local newspapers, and this was one of their first publications from 2010 in regards to the subject, and we've certainly seen this quote playing out in terms of sharing news being a very important factor in communication and integration in the last 7 years since that time. Certainly with the election last year, we've seen it continually. So there's a lot of good news going on in terms of this interaction, and the exposure to social media and exposure to newspaper articles through social media increases trust in media, which is great. You see, particularly because on Facebook people are sharing with their family and friends, that also increases the trust because you're getting some layover trust from people that they already know and have trust in. So social media in general drives about 4 to 8% of all web traffic for local newspapers. Increasing interaction in social media can increase that traffic up to about 1%. So it's pretty small, but it's still important to be reaching those people that you wouldn't necessarily be reaching otherwise. So we see this post, which is one of mine from a few months ago. I shared it with friends because I'm in psychology. It was about mindfulness and meditation, and that was something I thought a lot of my friends would be interested in. So you see people sharing for personal reasons, and it's about 37% of all social media users who are sharing that information on social media. You're not just seeing it amongst millennials, amongst young people. The use of social media by those 50 and older is growing every day. It doubled between 2009 and 2010. So you're really looking at a broad audience by interacting with social media. There's a lot of debate in terms of what's considered public and what's considered private. There's some really interesting research in terms of what people consider public versus private in terms of what they're putting out on Facebook and Twitter. And there's a lot of difference in what journalists believe is public information that can be used as a source and private information that cannot be used as a source. A big issue has to do with friends on Facebook, because Facebook friends are people generally you know or have a personal connection with. There's a lot of questions as to whether or not those are legitimate sources, particularly because that information people perceive as being more private. You can set your Facebook privacy settings, as I have an example of, that people feel like they have more control over that information and feel it's a violation of trust if somebody were to misuse that information that would be posted publicly. One example that I found in the research had to do with a state senator. The state senator was complaining about the governor and said, "The governor's terrible, I'd make a better governor." Is that a campaign announcement? Is that a headline of "State Senator Slams Governor"? The researchers found that journalists generally said no, that wouldn't be an acceptable source to use for a story, and that, again, the state senator would feel like it was a violation of his privacy for that to have been done. Again, because after the New York Times developed their social media desk, they have started restricting what their journalists are allowed to post publicly in terms of their own opinion on their own personal sites. And a lot of other newspapers are doing this as well. Part of it is they don't want to worry advertisers. Part of it is they don't want their journalists leaking information about stories that are coming out in a couple of days. You see this less in local newspapers than you do nationally, but you're seeing it increasingly everywhere. So Twitter is significantly more public. You're blasting information out. It's generally considered by journalists to be an acceptable source. So when's a tweet a source and when's it just a tweet? Again, publicly posted information is generally considered acceptable both by individuals and by journalists as a whole. It's used significantly more frequently by the national media until they can get a reporter on the ground to be reporting the story directly. But you're also seeing it emerging in local newspapers, particularly in natural situations of natural disasters or emergent stories where they want to get information out quickly before they can get a full report completed. So one example is the Texas wildfires last month. This gentleman posted a tweet with a very unusual picture of the wildfires. And as far as journalists are concerned, it would be a perfectly acceptable source for a story on the wildfires to be able to use this tweet and this information and the picture. There's a lot of talk about Twitter becoming the new newswire. In some ways it is, because you see that information coming out quickly, more quickly than you do on the news wires oftentimes. But Twitter's not necessarily updating for accuracy. One of the things that people trust most about trusted media sources is the accuracy. If things change, if information or initial information is correct in emergent stories, you change it, you update it, you let people know what's accurate. So Twitter's not necessarily going to become the new newswire, but it is where a lot of information is going to break. Journalists still prefer the skills of the trade. They still prefer interviews. They still prefer using quotes over tweets, but you're seeing a mixture developing over time. Again, the accuracy is super important and the changes, but there's also a competition for speed with non-news sources. You have blogs, you have competing sources that look like news. And so there's a lot of pressure on journalists to get the information out as quickly as possible. But you've also got to keep in mind that the accuracy perspective is super important for the respect that traditional media sources still have. So Facebook versus Twitter, when is it good to use which? On Facebook, you tend to see people using it longer per day. So you may see people interacting with each other about an article more. They are more likely to read an article in part or in whole. You also see people more likely to interact with your business Facebook pages in terms of the newspapers. So you'll see that questions receive greater interaction if you're asking your community on Facebook a question about their thought on, we're talking about city council meetings, the city council meeting, or their thought on an article. You'll get a lot more interaction that way than you would just with a statement. You'll see people discussing issues, again, both with friends and family and interacting with your Facebook page. And pictures will draw significantly more attention to your posts than just having a text post. So if you have a big, bright picture, again, it'll just make people more interested, more likely to click on the link, more likely to interact with you. There's also, again, a great reader trust because those recommendations of stories that are shared are coming from their friends and family. They're people they know and generally considered trusted news sources. On Twitter, it's much more designed for fast information, for quick, on-the-go, checking it throughout the day. Twitter users value statements. Those statements receive greater interaction rather than questions. You're limited to 120 characters, so there's not much of an intellectual tome you can develop in 120 characters in response to a question. You see a lot of people on Twitter exploring news and just looking for exposure and awareness. What are the current headlines? What's going on? People on Twitter are more likely than people on Facebook to click on the link and actually look at the article, but they will look at that article for significantly less of a time frame than somebody coming to your website from any other source, including Facebook. Using hashtag draws a lot of attention to your posts. So I don't know how many people are familiar with hashtags, but it's a way to connect your post to other posts about the same stories. So if we're talking about the Texas wildfires and you use hashtag Texas wildfire, then you will see your story being aggregated with other posts about the Texas wildfires, and you'll get attention from people who are not necessarily your followers on Twitter or followers of your followers. So you'll get attention that you wouldn't get otherwise by utilizing those hashtags. And keeping up with what are the trending hashtags is, again, important for getting that additional viewership rather than just making up your own hashtag. You're not going to get as many people paying attention that way. Twitter's great for headlines with a link to the full article. Again, people are very likely to click that link and go to the article. They're just not likely to spend much time on it. So there's a lot of cool research on the psychology of being informed, particularly as it relates to social media. So exposure to news headlines leads to a feeling of, I know what's going on. Even if they haven't read the rest of the article, even if they don't know the full story, just by having the headline, they feel like they're well informed. And just as in person, people want to seem smart. They want to seem in the know. They want to be respected for that information. It's the same online. So people use sharing of news articles as a status-seeking activity. So they want their friends to think that they're smart, that they know things, and they want their friends to believe that they're a trusted and respected source for information in the future. There's a big impact in terms of education level in regards to who is most likely to share information, particularly as it comes to local newspaper articles. It's going to be people with higher education, people with a high school diploma or a GED are less likely to share that information than if they have a bachelor's degree or higher. There's a really important piece about the stability of news use in age cohorts. So even though we're seeing the 50-plus crowd increasing their use of social media, they're still using basically the same sources that they've used over time, and they're using them with basically the same frequency. Even though they're sharing in a different platform, they may be reading it online versus reading it in paper, they're still doing it in basically the same way. So it's a really important piece for connecting with younger potential readers, because if you connect with them now, they're more likely to continue reading your newspaper and trusting local news in general than if they're just seeing New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, and the big names in the field. So if you can connect with them at a younger age, generally that stabilizes at around 25, 26 years old. So if you can connect with them at or before that time frame, you're more likely to keep them as a reader over time. One of the really cool things that sports journalists are doing in regards to social media is they're using those platforms a little bit differently. There's some controversy as to whether or not it's good use of time to follow athletes. Some believe it is because an athlete may say something crazy that's worth reporting on, but most say that what an athlete had for dinner isn't worth reporting on, so it's kind of a waste of their time. A big difference has to do with overseas athletes, particularly for local newspapers. If you have a local athlete that goes on to play soccer in the UK, for example, then the people back home want to hear those stories. They want updates on that. So a quick and easy way to follow those athletes and get that information to be able to report on it is through Facebook and Twitter. Sports journalists are also using fan forums, which you're not seeing in any other area of journalism. They're using it mostly for fan reactions. See if the fans believed that hiring the new third base coach was a good idea, and to be able to report on those fan reactions in addition to the rest of the full story about the third base coach. You're also seeing on those fan forums that insiders will sometimes post information, will sometimes leak information to get a bit of the public reaction before that's announced publicly. So those sports journalists are often using those fan forums to get that insider information, to get a jump on writing those articles as soon as that information is posted publicly. There are a ton of resources. And so if you all want to dig in deeper into this information, you are more than welcome to. You can go on for hours and hours. I could literally have talked for a lot longer. And so we have printouts of all of my slides, including the resources, if you want to look through these articles yourself. A lot of the articles are based on research done here in the US, but you also see some really cool research being done around the world with local and community newspapers everywhere.